The room went dead silent as Emma raised her violin to her shoulder. The mocking laughter of her classmates still echoed in her ears, but when her bow hit the strings, something miraculous happened. The music that poured from her was nothing short of breathtaking. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The air in the classroom felt heavier than usual, a mixture of anticipation and quiet judgment hanging in the corners. As Emma Barnes entered, her faded shoes clicking softly against the scuffed tile floors, the rustling whispers seemed to pause, only to return once she had taken her seat in the back row. Emma wasn't invisible, but she was something much more comfortable to the other students. A safe target. Her worn jeans, her unremarkable sneakers, and the battered violin case she carried were all silent signals to them. Signals that she didn't belong to the world they occupied. Their world was filled with expensive clothes and shiny new gadgets, a world in which Emma's modesty didn't fit. She had long learned that silence was safer than speaking. Blending into the background was more predictable than standing out, but there was no escaping Mrs. Wilson's gaze. Emma felt the weight of it before she even heard the teacher's words. Mrs. Wilson stood at the front of the class, a sharp, polished woman in expensive heels that clicked with a rhythm all her own. Her posture was as rigid as her personality, perfectly composed, perfectly immaculate. She didn't waste an opportunity to make her power felt. And Emma was just the latest object of her scorn. When Mrs. Wilson's sharp eyes settled on her, Emma could already sense the tension, the way the air seemed to change when the teacher locked on her target. Emma's hands instinctively tightened around the worn strap of her violin case. She could feel the familiar pressure in her chest, the one that always built when she was singled out, the one that made her want to shrink, to disappear. "Emma, why don't you play us something on that violin of yours?" Mrs. Wilson's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and biting. The room tensed, every student waiting for her to either reject the challenge or play along. "Maybe you can play us a tune that'll brighten up this dreary classroom." The words weren't an invitation. They were a command wrapped in sarcasm, designed to elicit laughter. And it worked. The class burst into laughter, a quick, cruel ripple that only made Emma's heart sink deeper. Her face flushed crimson as she gripped her violin case tighter, trying to hold on to whatever dignity remained. But it didn't matter. Her cheeks burned, her throat felt tight, and every eye in the room was now on her. She wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Emma had never been one to seek attention, and the idea of performing for an audience of laughing peers made her skin crawl. But worse than that was the sting of Mrs. Wilson's mockery. She hadn't even seen Emma play, hadn't once shown the slightest interest in who she was outside of her clothes or her social standing. But what Mrs. Wilson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Emma's violin wasn't just an instrument to her. It was a piece of her soul, a legacy. She hadn't picked it up on a whim, nor had it been a casual interest. She had been playing since she was 5, under the watchful eyes of her grandfather, the man who had once held the revered position of concertmaster in the city's Philharmonic. He had taught her everything, the ways the strings could sing, the subtle power of dynamics, the depth of emotion that could be conveyed with just a bow and some strings. Music was her refuge, her sanctuary, her way of connecting to the world when words felt too heavy. As the laughter subsided, Emma remained frozen for a moment, her grip on the violin case a fragile lifeline. The class had no idea that beneath the surface of this shy, awkward girl, a skill had been cultivated with years of discipline and care. Her grandfather had always told her that music was an act of vulnerability, that it would reveal parts of herself she could never hide. He had always said that someday her music would make others see her, not as a girl from the back row, but as someone capable of more than they could ever imagine. Emma hadn't believed it at the time. She was too young, too unsure, but now, standing in the midst of this ridicule, she realized just how much of her grandfather's spirit was alive in her. Emma's violin wasn't just an object. It was the embodiment of all the quiet moments in her life, the moments when she had been alone with music and the silent whispers of her grandfather's encouragement. The violin had always been her strength, her refuge from the world, and now it might just be the only thing that could pull her from the depths of this moment. The classroom was unnervingly quiet after Emma stood up. the weight of the moment pulling at her every step. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from a surge of emotions that had been buried for far too long. She had been humiliated, made to feel small in front of everyone, but something in her, something deep inside, had snapped. She wasn't just going to sit there and let Mrs. Wilson's cruelty define her. Not anymore. With every step toward the front of the room, the tremors in her hands slowly steadied, the adrenaline pushing her forward. She reached the front and carefully placed her violin case on the desk. The familiar weight of the instrument, the smooth wood, the coolness of the strings beneath her fingers, everything came rushing back, grounding her. She had played before, but this was different. This wasn't just a practice session in the comfort of her bedroom. This wasn't just another lesson from her grandfather. This was her moment, her chance to show them all who she truly was. Emma took a deep breath, feeling her chest tighten with a mixture of nerves and resolve. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the judgment, the expectation. Mrs. Wilson's mocking gaze was fixed on her, the cruel smirk still lingering on her lips. But Emma refused to look at her. She couldn't afford to. She was no longer playing for the teacher or the students. She was playing for herself. With deliberate care, she opened the case, revealing the violin, a symbol of her identity, her legacy, and her strength. She lifted the instrument to her shoulder, her movements slow and controlled, despite the storm swirling inside her. The bow rested lightly in her hand, almost as if it were an extension of herself, ready to unleash everything she had kept hidden for years. And then she began. The first few notes were delicate, soft, but there was power in them. The melody swelled, rising with an intensity that caught the class off guard. Emma's fingers moved over the strings with an almost unnatural precision, each stroke of the bow bringing out a rich, resonant sound that filled the room, bouncing off the walls. She wasn't playing something simple or easy. This was Carmen, a piece so fiery, so full of emotion, that it demanded the player to pour their soul into it. The music spoke of passion, of desire, of loss, every note a reflection of everything Emma had kept inside, locked away from the world. She played as if she could feel every word of the story, the seductive sweep of the strings, the fierce attack of the fast passages. It all came alive in her hands. Her body swayed with the rhythm, her eyes closed, lost in the music. She wasn't just playing the violin. She was embodying the very essence of the piece. Every movement of her fingers, every bow stroke, seemed to tell the story of Carmen herself, defiant, fierce, and untamed. The air in the classroom thickened with the weight of her performance, a tension that no one had expected. The class had gone from quiet disbelief to stunned silence. Every student, even those who had mocked her moments before, was mesmerized, caught in the spell of Emma's playing. Mrs. Wilson's smirk had faded, replaced by an expression of confusion and surprise. Her sharp, judgmental eyes were no longer fixed on Emma with disdain. They were wide with disbelief, her mouth slightly agape as she watched the girl transform before her eyes. The music flowed freely now, without hesitation. Emma's emotions poured into each note. Every fast passage, every slow, aching sweep of the bow was a revelation. She wasn't just some quiet girl from the back row anymore. She was a force, an undeniable presence. She was showing them all that there was more to her than the worn clothes and the faded backpack. She was showing them that her talent, her spirit, her very soul could not be confined to the image they had created for her. As the last notes of Carmen echoed in the room, Emma's breath came in shallow gasps. Her fingers stilled on the strings, and the silence that followed was deafening. She opened her eyes, her heart still pounding in her chest, and looked around. The room was frozen. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Emma's music had shattered the illusion that she was just another shy, unnoticed student. It had demanded attention, and it had taken it. Mrs. Wilson's eyes were wide, her lips parted in stunned silence. The classroom, once filled with the murmur of mockery, was now filled with nothing but awe. Emma's hands still trembled, but not from fear. Not anymore. The trembling was from the weight of what she had just done. She had shown them all who she was. The halls were alive with whispers the next day, soft murmurs that echoed off lockers and bounced down the narrow corridors. Emma couldn't escape the flood of voices, the shift in the atmosphere. No longer was she the quiet, invisible girl who sat in the back of the class. Now she was the subject of every conversation. "Did you hear Emma play yesterday?" someone asked in a breathless tone as they passed by. "She's a genius," another whispered. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as the words reverberated in her mind. Genius. It sounded so foreign coming from anyone else's lips. She wasn't used to being noticed like this, to being seen as more than just the girl with the worn backpack and the quiet eyes. Some of the students who had once snickered or ignored her now seemed to shrink away in guilt, their glances quickly dropping to the floor. Her music had forced them to see her. As she walked to the gates after school, Emma tried to push away the whirlwind of thoughts that clouded her mind. But just as she neared the exit, a figure stepped into her path. A man, tall and well-dressed, his suit impeccable, his appearance polished, yet not intimidating. He was in his early 40s, his face marked with experience and warmth. The air around him seemed to shift the moment he approached, and Emma instinctively felt the weight of his gaze. "I'm Richard Williams," he continued, smiling gently. "I used to be a student of Mrs. Wilson's. I was in the audience yesterday." His words hung in the air for a moment, allowing the connection to sink in. Emma's eyes widened as she realized who he was. Richard Williams. He was a name she had heard before, a renowned concert pianist, celebrated for his talent and success. And he had been in the audience? "I've never heard such talent from a young student," he said, his eyes softening with admiration. "You belong on a much bigger stage than this." His words felt like a weighty blessing. "I'm here to offer you a scholarship to my music school," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You'll be able to study with some of the best musicians in the country. I've seen something in you, Emma, something that cannot be ignored." A scholarship? The words felt surreal. Emma's mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. A scholarship? To study with the best? Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat an echo of disbelief and excitement. Richard Williams, a man who had reached the heights she had never dared to imagine, was offering her a chance. It felt too big to take in. Emma stood frozen, trying to catch her breath. She had always known that she was different, that music was a part of her, but this was a validation she had never imagined could come to someone like her. But before she could respond, Richard's voice broke through her thoughts. "Take your time," he said gently, "but don't let this opportunity slip away." As he walked away, Emma stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. The world had just shifted, and she was no longer the girl in the back of the class. She was someone who had the potential to be more, to do more. And as the last traces of his figure disappeared from her view, she felt the first stirring of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. The belief that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of something greater. The weeks following Emma's acceptance of the scholarship were a whirlwind of change, so rapid and profound that they left her breathless. She had stepped into the world so different from her own, a world filled with faces that had always been at the forefront of musical excellence, a place where talent was measured by its brilliance, not by the humble means of its origin. But Emma's presence there was not a mistake. She had earned her place, and every moment she spent among these gifted musicians, she felt the quiet thrill of belonging. The music school was a haven where the competition was fierce, the pressure constant. It was a place where excellence was expected, where every student was pushed beyond their limits. Yet despite the pressure, Emma thrived. Her talent was undeniable, but it was her determination and resilience that truly set her apart. The once shy, overlooked girl in the back of the classroom had become a force to be reckoned with. She practiced relentlessly, her violin always at her side, a constant companion. She had no intention of letting anyone, especially herself, forget the fire that had been kindled in that small classroom months before. She was no longer the girl who played in secret. She was a woman who had found her voice and was determined to share it with the world. Then came the invitation. It was unexpected, almost surreal. Emma had been asked to perform as a soloist with the orchestra at a prestigious concert hall. The news felt like a dream, one she had never dared to imagine. But now, standing backstage, watching the lights of the auditorium glow faintly through the heavy velvet curtains, she realized that this moment was no accident. This was her time. She had worked for this, fought for it in the silence of her own struggles. The audience was a sea of faces, each of them eager to witness something extraordinary. The applause that greeted her as she stepped onto the stage was deafening. But it wasn't fear that coursed through her veins. It was something more. Confidence. It was the confidence that came from knowing, beyond any doubt, that she belonged here. This was where she was meant to be. As the orchestra began, Emma's bow danced across the strings, her fingers moving effortlessly, every note flowing with the ease of someone who had spent years pouring her soul into this very instrument. The piece she performed was not just a composition. It was a reflection of everything she had been through, every hurdle, every whisper of doubt, and every triumph that had led her to this point. The music was her voice, and through it, she spoke to the world in a language that needed no translation. And then, in a moment of perfect, pure artistry, the final note rang out, echoing through the hall. Time seemed to freeze for an instant. For the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to fully feel the weight of what she had accomplished. As she took her bow, the applause was so intense it shook her to her core. It wasn't just admiration, it was respect. For Emma Barnes, the quiet girl who had once been mocked, had become the kind of musician that commanded the attention of an entire room. But as she stood there, the roar of the crowd still vibrating in her ears, her eyes scanned the audience. And there, sitting in the front row, was Mrs. Wilson. Her once confident, mocking expression had been replaced by something Emma had never expected to see from the woman who had belittled her: humility. Mrs. Wilson, the teacher who had once dismissed her as a poor, awkward girl, was now watching her with wide eyes, eyes filled with awe and perhaps, for the first time, recognition of her true potential. The emotional weight of that moment hit Emma like a wave. This wasn't just about mastering the violin. This wasn't just about the music. It was about reclaiming her dignity, about proving to herself and the world that the quietest souls sometimes carried the fiercest strength. She had been underestimated, dismissed, but now she stood before everyone as a triumph of talent, resilience, and the unyielding will to rise. As the applause continued to echo, Emma felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude and relief. She had done it. She had faced her fears, her doubts, and had transformed them into something beautiful. The girl who had once sat in the back of the classroom, shrinking from the world, was now a woman who stood in the spotlight, her music the very thing that defined her. The journey had been long and painful, but Emma had conquered it, and she was finally seen. Not just as the quiet girl, not just as a student in the back row, but as someone whose voice, whose music, could change the world. And with that, Emma knew her triumph was not only in the music, it was in the strength to rise when no one expected it, to prove that even the meekest souls could ignite the fiercest fires.